What would you do if an elderly man with a mysterious past left you a gift that could change your life forever? As Lila Hayes faces eviction, a surprising act of kindness sets her on a journey of discovery, redemption, and hope. One that might just heal more than her own struggles. Stay tuned to find out the secret that binds their lives together in ways no one could have imagined. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? Share it in the comments below. The biting chill of a December morning nipped at Lila Hayes' fingers as she clutched a tray of steaming coffee cups. Her shift at the quaint downtown grocery store in Ashton, Kentucky was just starting, but exhaustion had already taken root. The small-town charm, with its twinkling Christmas lights and decorated storefronts, felt more like a mockery than a comfort. Carols floated in the air as cheerful customers bustled through the aisles, their arms full of festive treats. Yet the holiday cheer seemed to stop at Lila's weary expression. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She didn't need to look to know it was another notification about her overdue rent. Still, she swiped the screen and grimaced at the reminder. Balance due, $850. Payment required immediately. The knot in her stomach tightened. Her landlord had already left a terse letter taped to her door the night before, warning that eviction was imminent if she didn't catch up. "Lila, you good?" called Nancy, her coworker, from the next register. Her voice was friendly, tinged with concern. "Yeah," Lila replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired." Nancy gave her a knowing nod but didn't press further. Everyone in Ashton knew Lila's story. A 30-year-old working herself to the bone to make ends meet while caring for her younger brother, Jacob. On her lunch break, Lila slipped into the back alley of the store to catch her breath. She pulled out her phone and opened the calendar app, scrolling through the sea of red reminders. Rent, groceries, Jacob's school fees. It all loomed like an insurmountable wave. Jacob. The thought of him gave her the smallest flicker of hope. He was only 15 but full of bright aspirations. Recently, he'd been talking non-stop about joining the school choir's Christmas performance. Lila hadn't had the heart to tell him they couldn't afford the uniform fees. Her break ended too soon, and she returned to the hum of checkout scanners and the distant jingle of the store radio playing Jingle Bells. By the time her shift ended, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Main Street. As Lila walked home, the cold stung her cheeks and her breath puffed out in soft clouds. The streets were quieter now, most people already tucked away in their warm homes. She clutched her coat tighter, wishing for the same. Turning the corner onto a residential street, her steps slowed. An elderly man, bundled in a threadbare coat, was struggling with a load of grocery bags. His frail frame wavered with each step, and one of the bags slipped, spilling its contents onto the frosty sidewalk. Without hesitation, Lila quickened her pace. "Let me help you," she said, crouching to gather the cans and vegetables. The man looked up, startled, but his face softened into a tired smile. "Thank you, dear. My old bones aren't as reliable as they used to be." She picked up the last apple and stood, balancing the weight of his bags in her arms. "It's no trouble. Where are you headed?" "Just 2 blocks down," he said, gesturing with a shaking hand. "The White House with the blue shutters." The walk was short but filled with small talk. His name was Earl Whitmore, a widower who'd lived in Ashton for over 40 years. He mentioned how the holidays weren't the same since his wife passed away, his voice tinged with quiet sorrow. When they reached his doorstep, Earl turned to her with gratitude. "Thank you, young lady. I don't get much company these days." "It's really no problem," Lila replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Have a good night." As she walked away, something about Earl lingered in her mind. A quiet resilience, a kindness that reminded her of her late mother. She didn't know it yet, but their paths were about to intertwine in ways that would change both their lives. The walk to Earl Whitmore's house was short but filled with a quiet charm. As Lila balanced the grocery bags in her arms, she noticed how Earl moved cautiously, his steps deliberate as if the weight of the world rested on his narrow shoulders. They exchanged light conversation, though it was clear Earl wasn't one for small talk. His voice was warm, but there was a reserved quality to it. A man used to keeping his thoughts to himself. "You must be new to the area," Earl said, glancing at her with a faint smile. "Not really," Lila replied, adjusting the bags. "I've lived here most of my life, but I guess I'm easy to miss." Earl chuckled softly. Not when you're this helpful. When they reached Earl's house, Lila couldn't help but pause. The small Victorian-style home, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, carried an air of quiet dignity. Twinkling lights framed the windows, and a wreath hung crookedly on the front door, hinting at a love for Christmas that hadn't quite faded with time. "Come in for a moment," Earl offered, holding the door open. "It's the least I can do." Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around Lila like a comforting blanket. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the aroma of aged wood and faint traces of dust. Earl's home was modest but filled with character. Vintage furniture, lace curtains, and shelves crowded with books and trinkets from a bygone era. Lila set the bags on the kitchen counter and let her gaze wander. By the fireplace sat a locked suitcase, its leather worn and weathered. Nearby, a wall of photographs caught her attention. The images told a story of a younger Earl, standing tall and proud beside a woman with a radiant smile and a child no older than 5. The edges of the photo had faded, but its significance was unmistakable. "That's my wife and son," Earl said softly, noticing her gaze. His voice carried a mixture of pride and sorrow. Christmas was her favorite time of the year. Lila turned back to him, unsure what to say. She could sense the weight of his words, the memories that seemed to linger in every corner of the room. "She passed some years ago," Earl continued, his eyes distant. "And my son, well, let's just say life has a way of creating distances you never thought possible." Earl busied himself making tea, moving slowly but deliberately. The clink of china and the whistle of the kettle filled the silence. When he returned, he handed Lila a steaming cup and settled into an armchair across from her. "Do you have family nearby?" Earl asked, his gaze steady. "My brother," Lila said, her voice soft. "Jacob. He's 15. I've been looking after him since our mom passed." Earl nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Family is everything, you know. It's easy to take it for granted until it's not there anymore." Lila felt the truth of his words settle heavily in her chest. She thought of Jacob, his bright smile and boundless optimism, and the weight of her responsibility to ensure he had a chance at the life he deserved. As they sipped their tea, the conversation turned to lighter topics: the weather, the bustling small-town life, the joys of Christmas. Yet Earl's words carried a wisdom that lingered long after he spoke. "I've learned the hard way," Earl said, his gaze distant again, "that it's not the things we accumulate that matter, but the moments we cherish. You don't realize it until it's too late." Lila wanted to ask more, to understand the stories behind his cryptic words, but something held her back. Earl seemed to sense her hesitation and offered her a kind smile. As she prepared to leave, Earl walked her to the door. "Thank you, Lila," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "You've done more than you realize today." "It was nothing," Lila replied, brushing off the compliment. Earl hesitated, then added, "There's something I'd like to show you when the time is right." The mystery in his words left Lila both curious and intrigued. She stepped out into the cold night, her breath forming soft clouds in the air. As she walked home, the faint glow of Earl's porch light lingered in her thoughts, a beacon in the quiet darkness. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air, but for once, Lila felt a faint warmth in her chest. She walked along the familiar route to Earl's house, a small bag of groceries in hand. It wasn't much, just a few staples she'd picked up during her shift, but it was the best she could offer. Earl's quiet kindness had lingered in her thoughts all week, and despite her own struggles, she felt compelled to help him in any way she could. The small Victorian house looked almost the same as it had before, except for a single candle flickering in the window. A simple wreath adorned the door, its red bow slightly askew. The decorations were understated, much like Earl himself, present but reserved. When Earl opened the door, his face lit up with genuine surprise. "Lila," he said warmly, stepping aside to let her in. "You didn't have to do this." "It's nothing," Lila replied, brushing off his gratitude as she placed the bag on the kitchen counter. "I figured you might need a few things." Earl chuckled softly, his voice carrying a note of affection. "You're too kind. Sit, please. Tea?" The warmth of the house enveloped her once more as she settled into her usual spot at the kitchen table. Earl moved about the kitchen with a slow but steady rhythm, filling the kettle and gathering cups. Lila's gaze wandered to the fireplace, where the old suitcase remained in its place, a silent guardian of whatever secrets it held. "You've decorated," she said, nodding toward the candle in the window. Earl glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "My wife always insisted on a candle in the window at Christmas. Said it was a sign of hope, welcoming anyone who might need it." Lila's chest tightened at the mention of his wife. "She sounds like a wonderful woman." "She was," Earl said softly, placing the tea on the table. His eyes grew distant, the weight of memories settling over him. Music was her love. Every Christmas she'd play carols on the piano, filling the house with the kind of joy you can't put into words. As they sipped their tea, the conversation turned to Lila's life. Earl listened intently as she spoke about Jacob, his love for singing, his dreams of joining the choir. Her words were tinged with guilt as she admitted, "I just wish I could do more for him. He deserves so much better than this." Earl's gaze softened, and he reached out to rest a hand on hers. "The weight we carry feels lighter when shared with someone who understands," he said gently. "You're doing more for him than you realize." The sincerity in his voice brought a lump to her throat. She hadn't expected to feel so seen, so understood in the presence of someone she barely knew. Yet Earl's quiet wisdom and kindness were a balm to her weary soul. Their conversation drifted to broader topics: life, choices, the things that truly matter. Earl spoke in riddles, hinting at a painful decision from his past that had cost him dearly. "I chased the wrong dreams," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "Spent so much time trying to prove myself I lost sight of what really mattered." Lila wanted to ask more, to uncover the story behind his words, but she sensed it wasn't the time. There was a fragility to Earl's confessions, a vulnerability that demanded respect. As the afternoon faded into evening, Lila rose to leave. Earl walked her to the door, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Lila," he said softly, "for your kindness." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me." Earl hesitated, then placed a hand on the old suitcase by the fireplace. "One day I'll show you what's inside," he said, his voice tinged with both promise and mystery. "But not yet." The words hung in the air as Lila stepped out into the cold. The flickering candlelight followed her down the street, its gentle glow a reminder of the connection they had begun to build. The day started with an ominous weight hanging over Lila. As she returned from her early shift at the grocery store, she noticed an envelope taped to her apartment door. Her stomach dropped before she even opened it, knowing all too well what it contained. Tearing the envelope open, she read the eviction notice. Final warning. She had 10 days to pay the overdue rent or face eviction. Her hands trembled as she clutched the paper, the looming deadline bearing down on her like a storm cloud. Every corner of her life felt like it was unraveling. Inside the apartment, Jacob sat at the small dining table, his school books scattered around him. The sight of her brother, so focused and full of potential, brought a bittersweet pang to Lila's chest. He deserved so much more than this cramped apartment and the constant worry that came with it. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jacob looked up, his eyes lighting up briefly before his expression turned hesitant. "Did you talk to the landlord? Are we okay?" Lila forced a tight smile. "I'm working on it, don't worry about that." He hesitated, then asked, "What about the uniform? The choir performance is next week, and I really need it to be part of the show." Her smile faltered. "Jacob, I don't know if—" "But you promised," he cut her off, his voice tinged with frustration. "You said you'd find a way." "Jacob, I'm trying," Lila replied, her voice cracking. "You have no idea how much You don't care enough," he snapped, slamming his chair back as he stood. "You're always making excuses." The words cut deeper than Lila expected. Before she could respond, Jacob stormed into his room and shut the door, leaving her standing there, clutching the eviction notice in one hand and her breaking heart in the other. Later that afternoon, Lila decided to clear her head with a walk to Earl's house. The cool December air stung her cheeks as she made her way down the street, lost in thought. When she turned the corner, she nearly bumped into Mrs. Cunningham, the elderly neighbor who always seemed to know everyone's business. "Oh, Lila," Mrs. Cunningham said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "You've been visiting Mr. Whitmore a lot lately, haven't you?" "Just helping him out," Lila replied curtly, trying to move past her. Mrs. Cunningham stepped closer, her tone shifting to one of mock concern. "Be careful, dear. People might get the wrong idea. An elderly man, all alone, and a young woman like you dropping by so often." Lila froze, her cheeks flushing. I'm just being kind, there's nothing wrong with that. Mrs. Cunningham gave her a knowing smile. Kindness is admirable, of course, but not everyone will see it that way. You wouldn't want anyone thinking you're taking advantage of the poor man now, would you? The insinuation was enough to set Lila's nerves on edge. She walked away without another word, her head down and her heart heavy. By the time she reached Earl's house, the weight of the day felt unbearable. Earl opened the door with his usual gentle smile, but his eyes narrowed with concern as he saw her face. Lila, what's wrong? He asked softly, stepping aside to let her in. It's nothing, she mumbled, sitting at the kitchen table. Earl joined her, his expression patient. You're a terrible liar, you know. His words brought an unexpected chuckle from her, and she sighed, finally meeting his gaze. It's just everything. Rent, Jacob, and now Mrs. Cunningham's comments. Earl frowned. What did she say? Lila hesitated, then relayed the conversation. Earl listened intently, his expression darkening at the mention of Mrs. Cunningham's insinuations. Kindness is never wasted, Lila, he said firmly, even when it's misunderstood. His words were a balm to her frayed nerves, but what followed was even more unexpected. Earl stood and walked to the fireplace, picking up a small photo frame. He handed it to Lila, who studied the image of a younger Earl standing beside a beautiful woman and a young boy. My wife and son, Earl said quietly. They were my world, but I spent too many years chasing the wrong things, thinking I had time to make it up to them later. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. Lila looked up, her chest tightening at the sorrow in his eyes. I don't share this to burden you, he continued, but to remind you, what you're doing for your brother, for anyone, it matters. It's never too late to show love. As she prepared to leave, Earl handed her a small sealed envelope. Keep this safe, he said, his voice steady, but his eyes carrying an unspoken depth. It's not for today, but someday soon, you'll know when to open it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than just paper inside. Thank you, Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. Take care, Lila, Earl replied, his words laced with quiet determination. Lila stepped out into the evening, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. The faint glow of Earl's candle flickered in the window, a steady light in the growing darkness. Lila arrived at Earl's house on a crisp December afternoon, the cool air carrying the faint scent of pine and chimney smoke. As she approached, she noticed Earl sitting on his porch, his eyes fixed on a small, worn photograph in his hands. The lines on his face seemed deeper today, his shoulders slightly slumped. Hey, Earl, Lila greeted gently, stepping onto the porch. Earl looked up, his expression softening as he tucked the photograph into his coat pocket. Ah, Lila, you're a welcome sight, as always. Lila hesitated, unsure if she should pry, but the melancholy in Earl's eyes lingered like a shadow. You okay? You looked deep in thought. Earl gestured to the empty chair beside him. Why don't you join me for a bit? It's a day for reminiscing, I suppose. Settling into the chair, Lila waited patiently. Earl's gaze drifted to the horizon, his voice quiet but steady as he began to speak. There was a time, he started, when I thought success meant everything. I built a business from nothing, a small company that grew and grew. I worked hard, harder than most, and I thought I was doing it all for my family. Lila listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. But the truth is, Earl continued, his voice tinged with regret, I lost sight of what mattered. My wife, Margaret. She was my anchor, my reason for everything. And yet I let her slip away. Not by choice, but by neglect. I was too busy chasing the next deal, the next achievement, to notice the distance growing between us. He paused, pulling out the photograph again. He handed it to Lila, who saw a younger Earl standing beside a beautiful woman and a young boy. That's Margaret, he said softly. And my son, James. Lila traced the edges of the photograph, her heart aching at the sorrow in Earl's tone. They're gone now, Earl said, his voice cracking slightly. Margaret passed first years ago. James, he hasn't spoken to me in decades. I suppose I've failed them both in different ways. Lila struggled to find the right words, but Earl seemed to sense her unease. Don't feel sorry for me, Lila, he said, managing a small smile. I've made my peace with it as much as one can. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that time is the most precious thing we have. Once it's gone, there's no buying it back." His words struck a chord in Lila. She thought of Jacob, his frustration earlier that morning, the hurt in his eyes when he accused her of not caring. "I think I've been so focused on keeping us afloat," Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I've forgotten to really be there for Jacob. He deserves more than just survival." Earl nodded, his gaze steady. "He's young. He'll forgive you if you show him your heart. It's never too late to make things right." Before Lila left, Earl disappeared into his house for a moment and returned with a small book. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to Margaret," he said, handing it to her. "She loved poetry. This book, it brought her peace, and maybe it can do the same for you." Lila accepted the book with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Thank you, Earl," she said, clutching the book tightly. Earl smiled faintly. "Take small moments, Lila. Appreciate them, even when things feel impossible. You'd be surprised how much they matter." As she prepared to leave, Earl added one last thought. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "sometimes the only way forward is to let go of the past." His words lingered in the air as Lila walked down the path, the book of poetry pressed to her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that Earl's story held more than he was letting on. But for now, she let his wisdom settle over her like a warm blanket. Lila stood in the kitchen, Jacob's school notice in her trembling hands. The crisp white paper outlined every detail of the upcoming Christmas choir performance, the dates, the attire, and most painfully, the participation fees. Jacob's excitement about the event had been palpable all week, but the reminder of her financial constraints weighed heavily on her. She sighed, folding the paper neatly and placing it on the counter. The kitchen felt colder than usual, the unlit Christmas lights on the windowsill serving as a silent reminder of what she couldn't provide. "Mom," Jacob's voice called from the living room, breaking her reverie. "Have you seen the choir flyer? I think I left it on the table." Lila clenched her jaw before forcing a smile and handing him the notice. "Here you go, sweetie." Jacob scanned the paper eagerly, his eyes lighting up as he imagined the performance. "I can't wait. We're practicing this really cool medley with carols and—" His words trailed off as he noticed Lila's strained expression. "What's wrong?" Lila hesitated before answering. "It's nothing, Jacob. We'll talk about it later." Jacob frowned but didn't press further. "Okay, I'll be in my room." His voice was subdued, and as he disappeared up the stairs, Lila's heart ached. Later that afternoon, while walking through town, Lila encountered Mrs. Cunningham, who stood near the bakery, her hands tucked into a fur-lined coat. "Well, Lila," Mrs. Cunningham said, her voice dripping with feigned concern, "I couldn't help but notice how much time you've been spending at Earl Whitmore's house. It's so considerate of you to keep him company." Lila stiffened, sensing the underlying judgment in the woman's tone. "Earl's a good man," she replied curtly. "He appreciates having someone to talk to, and I'm glad to help." Mrs. Cunningham raised an eyebrow. "Just be careful, dear. People might get the wrong idea, especially with someone in your position." Lila's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. "Thank you for your concern," she said sharply, turning on her heel and walking away. As the cold air bit at her face, Lila replayed the conversation in her head, her frustration simmering. How dare Mrs. Cunningham insinuate such things? Earl had been nothing but kind, and their connection was genuine. Determined to fight back against her circumstances, Lila spent the evening searching for ways to earn extra income. She combed through online ads and called a few local businesses, eventually landing 2 side gigs, cleaning houses and babysitting for a neighbor. The work was grueling, with early mornings and late nights, but the extra money offered a glimmer of hope. Despite the exhaustion, Lila found a renewed sense of purpose. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward regaining control. One quiet evening, as the scent of homemade soup wafted through the house, Lila sat down with Jacob. "Jacob," she began softly, "I need to talk to you about the choir fees." Jacob's face fell, and he stared at his lap. "You can't afford it, can you?" Lila reached for his hand. "I'm so sorry, honey. I know how much this means to you, and I wish I could make it happen. But I promise you, we'll still make the holidays special, no matter what." Jacob hesitated before nodding. "It's okay, Mom. I guess I've been feeling like you don't have time for me anymore." His words hit Lila like a punch to the gut. "Oh, Jacob," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You're the most important thing in my life. I know I've been distant, but I'm going to do better. I promise." Jacob's arms tightened around her. "Thanks, Mom." As the evening wound down, Lila remembered the book of poetry Earl had given her. She opened it to the first page and found a small handwritten note tucked inside. The note read, "The answers you seek are closer than you think." Lila's brow furrowed as she stared at the words. What could Earl possibly mean? The mystery lingered in her mind as she turned off the lights and headed to bed, her thoughts swirling with questions. The December sunlight barely filtered through the frosted windows of Earl's modest home. Lila knocked gently on the door before stepping inside, as she often did on her Sunday visits. She found Earl seated in his armchair, surrounded by a box of old letters and faded mementos. The room felt steeped in reflection, the air heavy with unspoken memories. "Good morning, Earl," Lila greeted softly, setting her coat on the back of a chair. Earl looked up and gave a faint smile. "Morning, Lila. Come, sit with me. There's something I've been meaning to share." Curiosity piqued. Lila moved to the sofa, her eyes lingering on the scattered letters. "You're taking a trip down memory lane?" she asked gently. Earl chuckled dryly. "Something like that. It's long overdue, though, I'll admit." He picked up a photograph from the pile. A younger Earl stood beside a woman with soft curls and a bright smile, her hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy. "This was my family," Earl began, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "My wife Margaret and my son Robert. We were happy once. At least I thought we were." Lila leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment. "I worked hard to give them everything," Earl continued, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Built a business from the ground up, put in long hours, traveled constantly. I thought I was doing it for them. But the truth is I was doing it for myself, for my pride, for my ambition." His voice faltered, and Lila could see the regret etched into his features. "Margaret was the glue that held us together. She understood the price we were paying, but she never complained. Robert, though, he grew up resenting me. By the time Margaret passed, we were strangers living under the same roof." Earl set the photograph down, his hands trembling slightly. "After her funeral, Robert told me he couldn't do it anymore. He walked out that day and never came back. I tried to reach out, but every attempt felt like shouting into the void." He gestured to a letter at the top of the pile. The envelope was slightly yellowed with age, its edges frayed. "This is from Robert," Earl said quietly. "He sent it years ago, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I was too afraid of what it might say. That he hated me, that he never wanted to hear from me again." Lila's heart ached for him. She could feel the weight of his pain, a mix of regret and longing that mirrored some of her own struggles with Jacob. "Earl," she began softly, "maybe it's time. Whatever's in that letter, it might bring you the closure you need." Earl shook his head, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I'm ready for that, Lila." She reached out and placed a hand over his. "You've carried this for so long. Maybe the answers you're looking for are closer than you think." Earl hesitated, then nodded slowly. With trembling hands, he picked up the letter and stared at it for a long moment before handing it to Lila. "Will you read it for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. As she read the first few lines, her expression shifted. Surprise flickered across her face, mingled with something else Earl couldn't quite place. "What does it say?" Earl asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Lila looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Earl, I think you need to hear this." She took a deep breath and began to read aloud. The letter trembled in Lila's hands as she unfolded it. Earl sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the faded paper as though it held the weight of the years they'd lost. The room was silent save for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Lila hesitated, glancing at Earl. "Are you sure you want me to read this?" Earl nodded solemnly. "Please. I can't bring myself to do it." Taking a deep breath, Lila began to read. "Dear Dad, I've written and rewritten this letter a dozen times, unsure if you'd even want to hear from me. But I need to say this. I need you to know that I've been angry for so long. Angry at you for not being there, for always choosing work over us. But as I've grown older, I've started to see things differently. I understand now that life isn't always as simple as it seems when you're a kid." Lila paused, glancing up to see Earl's expression. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. "The truth is, I miss you, Dad. I miss Mom, and I regret walking away the way I did. I let my anger drive a wedge between us, and now that wedge feels impossible to remove, but if there's still a chance, I'd like to try. I'd like to rebuild what we lost, if you're willing. I hope you are." Her voice caught as she read the final words. "Love, Robert." Earl closed his eyes, his shoulders trembling as he absorbed the letter's contents. Lila set it down and moved to sit beside him. "I was wrong," Earl whispered. "I thought he hated me. I thought I'd lost him forever." Lila placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It's not too late, Earl. Robert wanted to try. Maybe he still does." Earl shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered face. "That letter was written years ago. He could be anywhere now, or maybe he's given up on me." "You won't know until you try," Lila said gently. "What do you have to lose by reaching out? Even if it's been years, it's clear he cared enough to write this. That has to mean something." Earl wiped his face, his expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "You're right. I've been a coward letting my fear stop me. Maybe it's time I stop running." The room fell into a contemplative silence. Lila felt the weight of Earl's regret and couldn't help but think of her own life. She had been so focused on survival that she'd neglected the emotional bond with Jacob. Earl's story served as a stark reminder of what she stood to lose if she didn't make changes. "I'm going to do better," Lila said suddenly. Earl looked at her, curiosity flickering in his tear-filled eyes. "With Jacob," she clarified. "I've been so caught up in trying to make ends meet that I've forgotten what really matters. You've reminded me of that." Earl smiled faintly, his expression softening. "It's never too late, Lila. Not for you, not for me." As Lila prepared to leave, Earl reached into the drawer of a side table and retrieved another sealed envelope. He handed it to her with a serious expression. "When the time comes, this will explain everything," he said cryptically. Lila frowned, curiosity sparking. "Earl, what is this about?" Earl shook his head. "Not yet. Just promise me you'll keep it safe." She nodded, tucking the envelope into her bag. As she walked home, the weight of Earl's story lingered in her mind, along with the mystery of the envelope. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Lila's apartment, illuminating the stark reality of her situation. A final eviction notice lay on the kitchen table, its bold red letters a constant reminder that she had only 3 days left to pay her overdue rent or vacate the apartment. Her chest tightened as she glanced at Jacob, who was quietly eating cereal, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing around them. "Morning," Jacob said, his voice unusually subdued. "Morning," Lila replied, forcing a smile. The weight of her panic pressed heavily on her chest as she gathered the courage to speak. Before she could say anything, Jacob put down his spoon. "You're worried about the rent, aren't you?" Lila froze, her hands tightening around the back of a chair. Yes, I am," she admitted softly. Jacob looked at her, his youthful face etched with concern. "Maybe I can stop choir, it's expensive, and I know you're trying to make everything work." His words pierced her heart. She knew how much the choir meant to him, how it was his one escape, a glimmer of joy in their otherwise difficult life. "Jacob, you're not dropping choir," she said firmly, her voice trembling. "But why not?" he demanded. "Why are we pretending things are fine when they're not? Why do you keep going to Earl's when we have so many problems here? Shouldn't we be focusing on us?" His frustration boiled over, catching Lila off guard. "Jacob, it's not like that," she began, her voice cracking. "Earl, he's been helping me keep my head above water. Talking to him helps me see things clearer. It doesn't mean I'm not trying to fix things here." Jacob shook his head, retreating to his room without another word. The sound of his door closing echoed in her mind, a painful reminder of the growing rift between them. Unable to sit still, Lila grabbed her coat and headed out, her steps carrying her to Earl's house almost on autopilot. She knocked on his door, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. Earl opened the door, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. "Come in," he said warmly, stepping aside. As they sat together, Earl listened intently as Lila poured out her frustrations. "I'm trying so hard, but it's never enough," she confessed. "I'm scared, Earl. Scared of losing everything, this apartment, Jacob's trust, and maybe even myself." Earl nodded thoughtfully. "Moments like these," he said after a pause, often reveal what we're truly capable of. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but sometimes the answers are closer than we think. He leaned back, his gaze distant. There was a time when I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I had lost everything that mattered, or so I believed. But I realized that while I couldn't change the past, I could still shape my future. It wasn't easy, but determination and creativity got me through. His words stirred something in Lila. "What did you do?" she asked. Earl smiled faintly. "I started small, one step at a time, and slowly the pieces began to fall into place." Inspired by Earl's resilience, Lila resolved to take action. That afternoon, she visited the local community center and inquired about temporary housing assistance. The process was daunting, but she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. By evening, she had also secured a few hours of babysitting work with a neighbor, an exhausting but necessary addition to her schedule. Despite her weariness, she felt a renewed sense of control. As she left Earl's house later that evening, she noticed a small package on his porch with her name written on it. Curious, she picked it up and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a key attached to a handwritten note. "The answers lie within," it read. Her brow furrowed as she turned the key over in her hand, questions swirling in her mind. What did Earl mean? What did the key unlock? Back at her small, dimly lit apartment, Lila sat at the kitchen table, staring at the key and the note. The handwriting was elegant but faintly shaky, as if Earl's hands had trembled while writing. She flipped the note over and squinted at the faintly penciled address on the back. It led to a local bank in town, fueling her curiosity and apprehension in equal measure. Jacob's soft footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. He leaned against the doorframe, his voice hesitant. "What's that?" Lila hesitated, but then smiled weakly. "Something from Earl. I think it might be important." Jacob studied her face, his earlier frustration softened. "Are you going to check it out?" Lila nodded slowly, determination building in her chest. "Yes, I think I have to." The following morning, Lila stood before the bank's imposing entrance. The building's red brick facade seemed almost daunting under the overcast sky. Her fingers tightened around the key in her coat pocket as she stepped inside, greeted by the faint hum of holiday music playing through the speakers. She approached the front desk, her voice quieter than she intended. "I believe I have access to a safety deposit box." The clerk, a woman in her 60s with a kind but tired smile, took the key and led Lila to a private room. The box itself was unremarkable, its simple, unadorned exterior betraying nothing of what might lie within. With a deep breath, Lila turned the key and lifted the lid. Inside was a small stack of envelopes, photographs, and a folded legal document. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the top item, a faded photograph of Earl standing beside his late wife and a young boy who must have been his son. As she sifted through the contents, her eyes fell on a letter addressed to her. The envelope was thick and her name was written in Earl's familiar hand. She unfolded the pages, her heart racing as she began to read. "Dear Lila, if you're reading this, it means I've entrusted you with something very dear to me. For years I've carried the weight of my mistakes, but meeting you has given me hope. Hope that kindness and resilience can carry forward in ways I never imagined. The property mentioned in the enclosed documents was meant for my son Robert. It was my way of building a bridge back to him, but life had other plans. I've come to see that perhaps its purpose was always to help someone like you, someone who has the courage to keep going, even when the odds feel impossible. This land represents a fresh start. Use it however you see fit. Build a home, a life, or simply a place to breathe. You've earned that much and more. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. With deepest gratitude, Earl." Lila's breath hitched as she finished the letter. Her eyes welled up with tears, a complex mix of gratitude, disbelief, and humility washing over her. She carefully unfolded the legal document, confirming the transfer of ownership for a small countryside property in her name. Her mind raced. The gift was almost unimaginable. Why would Earl choose her? What had she done to deserve such generosity? But beneath the whirlwind of emotions, a quiet resolve began to form. She would honor Earl's trust, not only for herself, but for Jacob and the future they could build together. As she stepped out of the bank, clutching the envelope tightly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from work, but her stomach dropped as she read the caller ID. Mrs. Henderson, Earl's neighbor. "Lila," Mrs. Henderson's voice was rushed, tinged with urgency. "It's Earl. He collapsed earlier today and the ambulance just took him to the hospital. I thought you should know. The phone trembled in Lila's hand as she processed the words. Earl, the man who had become her guide, her anchor, was now fighting for his life. Without hesitation, she turned and sprinted toward the bus stop, the envelope still clutched tightly in her hand. Lila's heart raced as the city bus screeched to a halt outside the hospital. The cold wind whipped around her as she hurried through the automatic doors, the sterile scent of disinfectant hitting her immediately. The hospital's stark white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights felt jarring after the comforting warmth of Earl's cozy home. She approached the reception desk, fumbling for words. Earl Whitmore. He was admitted earlier today. Can you tell me where he is? The receptionist, a woman with kind but weary eyes, typed into her computer. He's in room 307, third floor. He's stable for now. Relief washed over Lila, but her legs still felt heavy as she climbed the stairs, each step echoing the weight of her anxiety. Earl was sitting upright in his hospital bed when Lila entered. His complexion was pale, his hands frail, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw her. Lila, he said softly, his voice tinged with exhaustion but warm. I was hoping you'd come. Lila pulled a chair to his bedside, her voice trembling. Of course I came. Are you okay? Earl nodded faintly. Just a scare, the doctor said. My heart decided it needed a break. He chuckled weakly, then turned serious. I've had time to think about a lot of things, and I realized there's something I need to tell you. For the next hour, Earl opened up in a way Lila hadn't seen before. He spoke about his younger days, the relentless pursuit of wealth, the neglect of his family, and the profound emptiness he felt when his wife passed away and his son Robert severed ties. I was so blinded by ambition, Earl admitted, his eyes glistening. I thought providing financially was enough. But what good is success when the people you love feel like strangers? Lila listened intently, her own emotions swirling. Earl's story struck a chord deep within her, echoing her fears of failing Jacob. Your visits, Earl continued, they've been a gift. They reminded me of what matters: connection, kindness, redemption. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. But there's one thing left I need to do, and I can't do it alone. What is it? Lila asked, leaning closer. Earl hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to find Robert. I need to tell him. I'm sorry, before it's too late. Lila felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of Earl's request was immense, but so was his vulnerability. She saw in him the same longing she carried for Jacob, a desire to repair what was broken before time ran out. I'll help you, she said, her voice steady. We'll find him together. Earl's expression softened into a rare smile. Thank you, Lila. You don't know what this means to me. As Lila left the hospital that evening, the crisp winter air bit at her cheeks. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was a message from her landlord. Your eviction deadline is in 2 days. If payment isn't made, we will proceed with your removal. Lila's breath hitched as she read the words. The pressure of her own struggles came crashing down, threatening to drown her resolve. She stopped in her tracks, staring up at the darkening sky. How am I supposed to do this? She whispered to herself. The promise she'd made to Earl weighed heavily on her. But so did the reality of her situation. For the first time, she felt completely torn, unsure of how to balance her own survival with the needs of someone who had given her so much. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor of her nearly empty apartment, surrounded by a scattering of papers from Earl's safety deposit box. Each document told a fragment of his life, a man who had achieved much but had lost even more. Among the papers, one letter caught her attention. The ink had faded, but the address in Ohio was still legible, a potential thread to Robert. Her breath quickened as she folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her coat pocket. This was the first lead she'd found, and despite her own turmoil, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Earl's words echoed in her mind. You've shown me it's never too late to try. The town's library, though modest, was a sanctuary of quiet focus. Lila approached the librarian, a kindly woman with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. I need to find someone, Lila began hesitantly. It's important. The librarian smiled warmly. Let's see what we can do. What's the name? Robert Whitmore, Lila replied, handing over the letter. For hours, they combed through public records, digitized directories, and online databases. The old address in Ohio yielded no new leads, and frustration began to settle in Lila's chest. She tapped her foot nervously as the librarian continued her search. "I'll keep digging," the librarian reassured her. "Sometimes it just takes a little patience." When Lila returned home, her heart sank at the sight of an eviction notice pinned to her door. The bold red letters spelled out her dwindling time: 72 hours to vacate. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the notice free, crumpling it in her hand. The weight of her own problems surged forward, threatening to drown her resolve. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his face clouded with worry. "Is it the landlord again?" he asked quietly. Lila nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "It's nothing I can't handle." But Jacob wasn't convinced. "Why are you spending so much time helping Earl when we're about to lose everything? What about us?" The words stung, but Lila swallowed her frustration. "I'm doing this because it matters, Jacob. Earl doesn't have anyone else, and maybe, just maybe, we'll find a way through this too." Jacob didn't respond, retreating to his room. Lila stood in the silence, the walls of their small apartment feeling colder than ever. The next morning her phone buzzed. It was the librarian. "I think I've found something," the voice on the other end said. "There's a recent address linked to Robert Whitmore in Cincinnati. It's not a guarantee, but it's the best lead we've got." Lila thanked her profusely and hung up, her heart pounding. A flicker of hope sparked within her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the practicalities of the situation. Cincinnati was over 100 miles away. Her resources were already stretched to the breaking point. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice and then at the slip of paper with Robert's address. The decision loomed over her like a storm cloud. Should she risk everything to help Earl, or stay behind and fight to keep a roof over Jacob's head? Sleep eluded her that night. She replayed every moment of her conversations with Earl, the regret in his voice, and the way he had entrusted her with his legacy. By dawn, her mind was made up. Lila packed a small bag, counting her remaining cash. It wasn't much, but it would cover a bus ticket to Cincinnati. As she zipped the bag shut, she paused for a moment, gazing at Jacob's closed door. "I'll make this right," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. With one last glance at the apartment, she stepped out into the cold morning air, clutching the slip of paper tightly. Her journey to Cincinnati, and to Robert, had begun. The bus rolled into Cincinnati under a sky streaked with gray and orange, the city waking up to another winter day. Lila clutched her bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the slip of paper with Robert's address. The neighborhood was a mix of old brick buildings and newer storefronts, modest yet filled with life. She checked into a budget motel with just enough money to cover a single night, her stomach twisting as she realized the stakes of her trip. The address led her to a quiet residential area on the city's outskirts. She stood outside a small house with faded blue paint, unsure if it was the right place. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After asking a few neighbors, she discovered Robert worked at a nearby community center. The center was a modest building with children's laughter spilling out into the chilly air. Lila stepped inside, scanning the room until she spotted him. A tall man with salt and pepper hair, animatedly speaking to a group of teenagers. Lila approached him cautiously, waiting for a break in his conversation. "Robert Whitmore?" she asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. He turned to face her, his smile fading into guarded curiosity. "Who's asking?" "I'm Lila Hayes," she said, extending her hand. "I'm here on behalf of your father." The mention of Earl's name made Robert's expression harden. He motioned for her to follow him into a small office at the back of the center. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, crossing his arms. Lila took a deep breath and began. She told him about meeting Earl, about the man's regrets and his longing to make amends. Robert listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "My father," Robert said bitterly, "was more interested in building his empire than being a parent. When my mom died, he didn't even know how to be there for me. And now, after all these years, he wants to fix things." "It's not just about fixing things," Lila said, her voice firm. "He knows he can't undo the past, but he wants to try. And you? Don't you deserve to hear him out?" Robert's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up feeling like you don't matter?" "Yes," Lila said quietly, her gaze steady. "I do. And that's why I'm here. Because if I had the chance to mend something with someone I loved, I wouldn't let pride get in the way." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint chatter of children in the hall. Robert finally sighed, rubbing his temples. "I need time to think," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Lila replied. As she stood to leave, Robert opened a drawer and pulled out a photograph. It was a faded picture of Earl, a woman, and a young boy standing in front of a Christmas tree. Robert handed it to her. "Show him this," Robert said, his voice softer now. "He'll know what it means." That night, back at the motel, Lila stared at the photograph. The joy in Earl's younger face contrasted sharply with the regret she'd come to know. She slipped the photo into her bag, her resolve stronger than ever. Her journey wasn't over yet, but she could feel the pieces beginning to fall into place. The call came just as Lila was preparing to leave her motel room. Earl's neighbor's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Lila, you need to come back. Earl's taken a turn for the worse. He's been asking for you." Her heart clenched. She stuffed her belongings into her bag and hurried to the bus station, clutching the photograph Robert had given her. The old, weathered picture now felt like a fragile connection to Earl's past, a past she was determined to help him reconcile before it was too late. The bus ride home was agonizingly slow. Lila's mind raced with worry and memories. She thought of Earl's quiet strength and the wisdom he had shared over their many conversations. He had been more than just a kind old man. He had been a mentor, a reminder of the power of second chances. The rhythmic hum of the bus did little to soothe her nerves. She replayed her meeting with Robert, questioning if she had done enough to convince him. The weight of Earl's unspoken hope pressed heavily on her chest. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lila leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. "Please, let me make it in time." When Lila finally reached the hospital, she sprinted through the sterile hallways, ignoring the curious glances of nurses and visitors. Earl's room was at the end of the corridor, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Earl lay pale and frail, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The beeping of the monitor was steady, but slow. His eyes fluttered open as she approached, and a faint smile curved his lips. "I knew you wouldn't let me down," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lila sank into the chair beside him, holding his hand gently. "I met him, Earl," she said, pulling out the photograph. "Robert gave me this for you." Earl's trembling fingers reached for the picture. His eyes softened as he gazed at the faded image, memories flooding back. "He remembers," he murmured, a single tear slipping down his cheek. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of the photograph bridging the years of separation and regret. Finally, Earl turned to Lila, his expression both weary and resolute. "Lila," he said, his voice stronger than before, "promise me something. Tell Robert. Tell him I never stopped loving him. Even when I couldn't say the words, I always loved him." Lila nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll tell him, Earl. I promise." Earl's grip on her hand tightened briefly before relaxing. His eyes drifted closed, a faint smile still lingering on his lips. As the monitor beeped steadily, Lila stayed by his side, her own emotions a storm of sorrow and resolve. The photograph lay on the table, a silent testament to the ties that still connected Earl and Robert. Lila glanced at the monitor, her breath catching with each faint beep. She wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, its golden light touching the room like a quiet farewell. Earl's chest rose and fell one last time, his expression peaceful. The steady beeping of the monitor flattened into a single tone. Lila felt tears spill over as she clutched his hand, surrounded by the neighbors who had come to say goodbye. Earl was gone. The small gathering at Earl's home 2 days later was somber yet filled with warmth. The neighbors shared stories of his quiet acts of kindness, paying for groceries when someone was short, fixing a broken fence, or offering advice over a cup of tea. For a man who had once believed he'd lost everything, Earl had managed to touch countless lives in his final years. Lila sat quietly, a mix of sorrow and gratitude washing over her. She thought of the times Earl had listened to her fears without judgment, offering wisdom that seemed to come from a lifetime of hard-earned lessons. The lawyer cleared his throat, bringing the room to attention. He unfolded a crisp envelope, its edges slightly worn from handling. "Earl Whitmore's will is simple, yet profound," the lawyer began, his voice steady. Lila listened in disbelief as the lawyer announced that Earl had left his modest estate and the countryside property to her. A letter accompanied the will, and the lawyer handed it to her with a solemn nod. Sitting alone in the corner of the room, Lila opened the letter. Earl's handwriting was neat, but carried a slight tremble in the strokes. Dear Lila, you taught me that it's never too late to change. In you I saw the resilience and kindness I once wished I had embraced earlier in life. This property was meant for my son Robert, but fate had other plans. I hope you and Jacob will make it a sanctuary, a place to heal, grow, and dream. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters. With gratitude, Earl. Tears blurred the words as Lila folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. Earl's faith in her was both overwhelming and empowering. The sound of the door opening drew her attention. Standing in the doorway was Robert, holding the photograph Lila had given him. His eyes, though red from grief, were steady and filled with a quiet determination. I didn't get to say goodbye, Robert said, his voice cracking. He stepped closer, his gaze landing on the photograph in his hand. But you made sure he knew I cared. Thank you, Lila. Lila nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Robert joined the group, sharing his own memories of Earl from his childhood. The bitterness that had once shadowed his voice was now replaced with a somber acceptance. After the gathering, he approached Lila again. I heard about the property he left you, Robert said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think he would have liked us to visit it together. It might hold memories worth revisiting for both of us. Lila felt a new sense of purpose rise within her. Earl's legacy wasn't just the property or the lessons he imparted. It was the connections he had fostered, even in his absence. As the evening drew to a close, Lila stood outside Earl's home, gazing at the sky. The stars seemed brighter, as if reflecting the enduring light Earl had left behind. The countryside air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine as Lila and Jacob stepped out of the moving van. The property stood before them, a modest house nestled among rolling hills with tall oaks lining the driveway. For the first time in months, Lila felt a sense of peace washing over her. Jacob ran ahead, his laughter echoing across the field. This is amazing, Lila, he shouted, his excitement infectious. Lila smiled, her heart swelling with relief and gratitude. The inside of the house carried Earl's quiet touch. Simple furniture, a bookshelf lined with worn classics, and a small piano tucked into the corner of the living room. Jacob immediately gravitated toward the piano, running his fingers along the keys. It feels like it's waiting for us, he said softly. Lila nodded, setting down a box labeled Kitchen. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a blank canvas, a chance to rebuild their lives. Over the next few weeks, Lila poured herself into transforming the property. Inspired by Earl's letters and stories of his philanthropic efforts, she decided to create a community space where people in need could find support and resources. She reached out to local organizations and neighbors, sharing her vision of turning the property into a retreat for those seeking second chances. Volunteers soon arrived to help, painting walls, clearing overgrown gardens, and donating furniture. Jacob, too, found purpose. He spent hours helping with the renovations, his confidence growing as he contributed to something meaningful. Lila marveled at how much he had matured, their bond strengthened by shared effort and renewed hope. One crisp December afternoon, Robert arrived unannounced. Lila opened the door to find him standing there, holding a bag of tools and wearing a tentative smile. I thought I'd help out, he said, stepping inside. Over the next few days, Robert shared stories of his childhood, how Earl had taught him to fish, the summer spent camping, and the lessons Earl imparted about hard work and resilience. For the first time, Lila felt like she truly understood the man Earl had been before regret had overshadowed his life. As they worked together, Robert and Jacob formed an easy camaraderie, and Lila felt her own connection to Earl deepening. They were no longer strangers tied together by circumstance. They were a patchwork family, united by the legacy of a man who had quietly changed all their lives. On Christmas Eve, the house was filled with warmth. Volunteers and neighbors gathered to celebrate the progress they had made, the air buzzing with laughter and holiday cheer. A simple Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. Lila and Jacob stepped outside as the night deepened, carrying a candle. They walked to a small clearing overlooking the hills, the sky glittering with stars. Jacob lit the candle and placed it on the ground. For Earl, he said quietly, his voice steady. Lila knelt beside him, the glow of the flame reflected in her eyes. "It wasn't just a home he gave us, it was hope," she whispered, her heart full. As they stood there, the future felt less daunting. The hardships they had endured hadn't disappeared, but they had found something stronger: community, purpose, and the belief that kindness could transform lives. As we close the story of Lila, Jacob, and Earl, we're reminded of the profound impact that kindness, resilience, and second chances can have on our lives. Earl's journey was a testament to the power of redemption and the importance of embracing connection, even in the face of regret. Through his gift, Lila and Jacob found not just a home, but a renewed purpose, proving that even small acts of generosity can spark transformation. But this story also invites us to reflect on our own lives. Are there relationships we've neglected or moments of kindness we've postponed? Earl's legacy reminds us that it's never too late to reach out, to forgive, or to make a difference. What about you? How do you define a meaningful legacy? Are there small acts of kindness you've witnessed or received that have changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience, hope, and humanity. Let's continue to explore these powerful stories together. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.